Hello and welcome to the fourth and sadly final instalment of our end of week summaries for William Wordsworth Poetry, People and Place. I'm delighted that again this week I'm joined by Sally Bushell and Jeff Cowton. And I should also say that Sharon Ruston, who has been taking us through Dove Cottage, is obviously sorry not to be with us. She's our head of department at the moment, so is currently preparing us for a busy week next week when we start seeing the students again for the start of term. So we've had another very lively and engaging week. Thank you all for your comments. We've also had some very interesting sort of discussions, even controversies, we might say. So we're looking forward to addressing those a little bit later on. Again, it's been interesting to see you all engaging with the various themes and texts, but also extending these in a sort of more personal way. So, been some fascinating discussions, for example, from you on the meanings of letters and the role of letters in your lives, and how different forms of communication have changed across time. Obviously, again, I'd like to thank our excellent mentors, Andrew and Frank, and also thank our colleague Jen Ashworth for her great readings of Dorothy Wordsworth. As I say, I think one of the interesting things about this week has also been that it started to touch on the site of Dove Cottage as well, in that I know that Jeff has had visitors who've been both into the Jerwood Centre and around the cottage, and someone was lucky enough to see the Goslar letter out of its normal protective case, I gather, Jeff.
That was great. That was a great moment. Yes, the visitor came on Monday, and we even looked at the 1805 Prelude and together tried reading some of the handwriting, and it was difficult for us both, I have to say.
So it's lovely to have that movement from virtual to in person, and we hope some of the rest of you might get that chance if you're close enough. So moving on then to this week, we've obviously been thinking particularly about the writing around Dove Cottage and the importance of Dove Cottage and the site of Grasmere. We started really by thinking about William and Dorothy's journey to Dove Cottage, and had very interesting responses to those different accounts, the Christmas Eve letter and home at Grasmere. I think that interestingly, different kinds of responses. Some people were very interested in the factual detail of that journey, what the trip involved, and Frank provided some excellent sort of further contextual information for us around that. But also people were very interested in how to read the symbolism, if you like, of this journey, and I was very interested by the discussion of it as a pilgrimage, which I think Sally contributed to at one point. So thanks to you all for that. I know that this has been a journey which has been very interesting, particularly for Sally, who's thought about it a lot and has thought about recreating it in a project called Walking Home and has recreated some of it. Would you like to talk us through that, Sally?
Yes, well, we started off very ambitious and then we ended up not quite so ambitious, and Jeff was up for it. Jeff and I were up for it, and we wanted to do the entire route in real time. That would have been quite a challenge because they do about 21 miles in a day on the longest day in the middle of winter, which is impressive. So we were up for it, but so I actually went out with Louise Ann Wilson, an artist, and we kind of scoped out the route. It was very easy to scope out the route. You could reconstruct it pretty clearly from Leyburn through Wensleydale and across to the lakes. But we did it on the car, and we got as far as reconstructing different stages of the route. But basically, at that time of year, with all our other commitments, it just wasn't possible to do, although I would really like to do the whole route. So yeah, last Christmas, just before Christmas, called Walking Home, where, as you know, Simon, we walked just the final stage from Ambleside to Grasmere with the public, and arrived at Dove Cottage just as it was getting dark, and had some carols and mince pies, and it was actually really nice, and readings inside the cottage. So we did get a sense of arrival, I think, and the symbolic arrival. I mean, reconstructing the whole route, or when we went and drove in Wensleydale, it was interesting because it is a very unusual approach. The common approach to the lakes in the late 18th century would have been across the bay, as we know, from Lancaster and across Morecambe Bay by carriage. And we would now approach it, obviously, through road up past Windermere or down. So you don't very often come at the lakes from that direction, really. So it is interesting because you're kind of walking straight forward and you see the hill. You sort of walk right into that landscape in a really interesting, and it's beautiful as well. Wensleydale is beautiful. So yeah, so I enjoyed doing it. I mean, there were things that were just sort of amazing when you saw how far they walked, and they still in the letter be saying, oh, and then we just had a little, we just diversion, another extra mile up to the waterfall. And I was just thinking, there's no way I would be doing that extra mile. I've still got another 15 miles to walk. And also when you think we did it sort of in the winter when we were planning, and how short the days are in the winter. So they really are getting up very early, walking through darkness. It is quite impressive.
Yeah, I've done a few of the Yorkshire stretches as well, as you have, sort of, when I've been away there for summer holidays and things. And yeah, as you say, the thing that just strikes you is it's very impressive walking feat, isn't it?
Mm.
So obviously, thank you very much, Sally. The journey brings them to Dove Cottage, and the week has focused quite a lot on the processes of how they turn that into a home, how they kind of write home through things like home at Grasmere, and then the whole sort of process of the naming of places, making the surrounding area a home to. And we'll come back on some other aspects of that a bit later. But this just seemed a fantastic moment, Jeff, to ask you in a bit more detail than we've been able to so far about the major project you've been involved in recently, which is the recreation of Wordsworths Home. I mean, just to explain for the learners, obviously, as part of this week, Sharon has given you a great tour of Dove Cottage. That was filmed when we first made this course. Since then, we've had the Reimagining Wordsworth project, which has reimagined that site. Because of COVID, obviously, we were unable to update our own tour. And the site has changed an awful lot since we made that film. So could you just tell us a bit more about this process, Jeff, in terms of, that sense of how you tried to present the home of the Wordsworths and to reflect the home-making process that people have been thinking about this week?
Yeah, the Sharon's tour of the cottage is as it was and as it probably had been for 30 or 40 or more years, and it reflects a time from when the trust was set up in 1890, that if there was a piece of Wordsworth furniture, well, where else could you display it but the cottage itself? And it also reflected a time, of course, before we had such good interpretation methods through film or through other means, and the way of imparting the intellectual information, as it were, was through the guided tour. So to do a guided tour, you need 15 people in a room. To have 15 people in a room, you have to have the furniture against the wall. So if you like, the layout of the building as people saw it, you don't think of these things when you're visiting, but that's the logic between where things went. And so we wanted to do the visitor to experience Dove Cottage in a way that you could only do it by being in the building. So what could we take out of that so that you could just feel you were in their home? And so we wanted to provide the contextual information through a film ahead of time, so that when you went into Dove Cottage, you got your facts, if it were. You knew who William and Dorothy were, the dates, all that sort of thing. You could just be. And as we all know, we're so rich in information from the journals, from the letters, that it's very easy to construct certain moments in time, certain conversation, or Dorothy sitting in a certain place on a certain date, writing her journal, and we put together as many of these points as we could, so that everything in the house is fixed in a moment in time and with an artifact. So as you know, I'm often fond of saying, in Simon Lee, there is a tale in everything. And so as you go around Dove Cottage, everything there's a tale behind it. So a visitor going in, having got the contextual information, can simply sit and be for 20 minutes or however long they'd like to be. They don't have to talk, they don't have to do anything, they can just feel what it's like to be in a home, or they can ask about a certain thing and there will be the story behind it. So that's the sense. So when a visitor comes into the house, they're invited by a colleague to say, please make yourself at home. And how they then choose to respond is to them. And it's not when you go into Dove Cottage, you're not stepping into a perfectly reconstructed house of 1800 where everything is authentic to that period, because it simply can't be. But what the authenticity is, we hope, is the sense of it being a home, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I mean, fantastic. I've had online glimpses of it, and I think it looks superb. People saw the drawing room, is it, the upstairs room from this film? And as you say, the approach you've taken is itself a very Wordsworthian approach, isn't it? We think about the start of Michael and the stone, and he says, this might just look like a stone to you, but actually there's a story behind it. I know Sally's very keen on the poem Anecdote for Fathers, I think it is, which does the same thing with a key. And so that sense of objects having these meanings that can then be discovered. I think people will find visiting the cottage, if they're able to, fantastic. But for those who aren't able to visit, I gather you are going to provide them with a very special gift, Jeff. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, I mean, if we can turn down the dance music on the building site, and if some of the lorries turn their engines off and all that sort of thing, it's a very busy site at the moment, but we'll try to capture the essence of what a visit will be. It's not busy like this every day. Please do come. We would love people to follow up the MOOC with a visit to the house. And what, if I may say, one more thing, if I could, Simon, and that is that what we've also done is reintroduce words into the house, so that wherever you go in the building, you will find either a facsimile of Dorothy's journal, or a facsimile of the poems, or a facsimile of a letter, and you can see words written in the house. And we've even reintroduced Joanna Hutchinson, so Mary's sister. We've reintroduced her recipe book, which has got their own recipe for Grasmere gingerbread. So if a visitor can take a photograph of that and go and make some Grasmere gingerbread, as the Wordsworths would have enjoyed it.
Fantastic. So, I mean, just to clarify for learners what we're going to do then, I mean, Jeff has very kindly agreed to make a film of a tour of Dove Cottage to give you a sort of glimpse into it if you're not able to visit yourself. We'll put that up alongside, or as soon as we can, after this end of week summary. So it should be available there for all learners to view. We won't put it on YouTube as we normally do with these films, I don't think, because obviously this is specifically for people who've been part of the course, a kind of gift to them for getting to week 4. So thanks very much indeed for doing that, Jeff. I mean, that's a great lovely addition to the course. So it brings us on to life in Dove Cottage, and obviously there's been a lot of interest in that week. I think it's fair to say a lot of the discussion has been around the different roles between William and the women in the house who are supporting him, but also doing their own things as well at times. So there's been a lot of interest in the sort of gender division of labour, I think was one of the phrases I saw. Obviously a lot of interest in the relationship with Dorothy. And I think one of the things that learners have been trying to do, which is a difficult thing to do, is to kind of assess Dorothy's own life within the context of its time. For a woman living in the 1790s, 1800s, is she living within a kind of a house of freedom, or a house where she's having to battle against restrictions? What if I might turn to you, Sally?
Yeah. I mean, I think, again, with Dorothy, there's always a sort of double dimension. On the one hand, obviously she has, a lot of status in terms of what we've been talking about before, her support of William and their sort of attuned relationship and all the things she does. But on the other, then people feel, she sort of sublimated her own existence by that relationship. She's not really living for herself. And in a way, I think it is more complex than that. So I think, one, we need to remember that Dorothy's life was sort of mapped out for her to some extent. She would have been looking after her aunt and uncle in their old age, and in a caring role, and that would have been pretty much it. So I think there is no question that William sort of coming back for her, really, and finding her when they were young adults, and choosing to have her live with him, was extraordinary for her. She got to travel to places she wouldn't have done, and she has immense freedom relatively within the period, and she takes great advantage of that. You know, she's a great walker, she's out in nature, she's loving every minute of it. So it's always struck me, actually, I always found it quite odd that in a way in the Romantic period, women, a lot of women are much freer than they then become in the Victorian period. You know, things close down again slightly bizarrely, and I was wondering about that. I think, is it because it's the war, like nobody's really, because they're at war, that it's a bit, everything's a bit crazy? I don't know. But she always reminds me a bit of Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice, you know, sort of striding the fields and having a dirty petticoat and not really caring about that. So you're able to be a sort of more, not a tomboy, of course, but more like that than certainly you're then able to be 50 years later to some extent. So Dorothy definitely has sort of carves out for herself a life that she's pretty happy with. And again, a relationship with William is also this sort of slightly two-edged relationship, clearly very intense. And she's very invested in William and his life and his work. And actually often later on, you know, he'll be writing his letter, Dorothy keeps asking me, you know, why haven't I done this? Why haven't I written the excursion? Why haven't I published it? You know, so she has a strong sense of responsibility about his work and his life and his reputation. I personally don't see any need to go down a sort of incestuous route. I just think brother-sister relations or any sibling relations were much more physical and close than we are. You know, you would share a bed, sisters would share beds regularly, even in adult. It's not. So I think there's a very different, more intense kind of sibling relationship which they embody, but which I think is fairly typical of the time.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that full account, Sally. Jeff, did you want to come in on that?
I was just going to mention, I mean, I guess I'd kind of ask Sally this thought that Dorothy's precarious position of the period, as it were, say, as William was coming up to be married. I mean, we know, don't we, that the wedding journal is a very emotional account of the wedding day. I mean, do you sense in Dorothy an anxiety that what might become of her livelihood, as it were, once the wedding comes along?
Yeah, I mean, Dorothy obviously is very sensitive and sort of not delicate. She's not delicate, but she's very sensitive. So I think she's very intelligent. So she knows this is a major change, doesn't she? You know, and none of us like change. And of course, it's a massive change because it's just been her and William for all that time. She's been the major influence, and things are going to change, and her role is going to change. And so with her sort of high emotional intelligence, she recognizes that. And obviously it's like a traumatic event. You know, she doesn't go to the wedding, she wears the ring the night before. It's a big trauma for her. Again, I would say totally understandable, really, because yeah, obviously their relation changed, and she then has more of she does start to have more of an aunt role, and then a caring role in the family. I mean, in a sense, those anxieties, I guess, are allayed in that what we were saying about before, they seem to have quite discrete roles, Mary and Dorothy. So William doesn't just sort of put Dorothy aside when he marries Mary. Actually, she still has a very important intellectual and sort of moral and emotional role for him. So yeah, I don't think those fears do come to pass, but I think they're understandable.
Yeah. There's a we may have mentioned this on an earlier conversation. You mentioned Jane Austen. Learners might know the book by Marion Beavers, where she describes the compares and contrasts, if you like, the lives of Jane Austen and Dorothy Wordsworth, and it tells an awful lot too about the lives of young women at that time and the importance of marriage or not in terms of financial security. So it's a very enjoyable book. Just mention that.
Thanks, Jeff. I mean, I think the other book probably we'd all recommend on William and Dorothy is Lucy Newlin's book, All in Each Other, if I remember that correctly, which is an excellent study of the relationship and very good on this topic. I mean, for me, Sally got to advertise her book last week, so I'm going to advertise my book this week, if that's
one of my books.
Sally got to advertise one of her books, one of her many. And the reason I'm advertising this, someone bought your book as well, Sally. At least one learner has bought your book.
Great.
Yeah, so well done to them. So I've written a book recently called, I don't know if you see that, Mountaineering and British Romanticism. I'm not sure if it's in reverse writing or whatever.
It's the right way around. Just move it in front of your face so you can see it properly. There you go.
Oh,
yeah.
perfect.
Yeah, nice.
Very
yeah.
nice.
So I have a chapter in there on women mountaineers and women in the mountains in the Romantic period. And obviously Dorothy occupies a very important place in that history because she, with her friend Mary Barker and another group, climbed Scafell Pike, the highest mountain in England, in 1818. They were one of the first people to write a report of having climbed it. I think there's only one report known of before that. And the Wordsworth Trust did great things a couple of years ago, an exhibition, a recreation of that walk around that. But that led me to do a little case study in that book of Dorothy as a mountaineer. So trying to think about the wider context of that climb. And what's very interesting is when they're first arriving in Dove Cottage and exploring the area, you get a very strong sense of a gender division. So basically, William goes off into the mountains with John, his brother, or with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, or with other friends. Dorothy literally stays at home on one of these occasions. People probably know the extract, and does the ironing. She seems to spend about a day doing the ironing while they are off climbing. She will sometimes walk with William to the foothills and then leave him. Though they are often going across the pass to Patterdale to visit the Clarksons, who we might talk about later. So she gets quite high there. But over the next 2.5 decades, you get a remarkable development, really, of Dorothy as she goes further and higher into the mountains. Initially, very interestingly, suffering from vertigo. There's an occasion on Fairfield above Dove Cottage where she thinks she's going to collapse due to dizziness, and if William's not there, she thinks she would almost certainly have died. But she becomes increasingly an adventurous explorer, to the extent that in 1825 she writes to a friend of the family called Robert Jones. Now, Robert Jones was a friend of William's, who, interestingly, William had climbed Snowdon with in the 1790s on the occasion that is celebrated at the end of the Prelude. And Dorothy writes to William and she says, are you happy for me to guide you to the top of another Lake District mountain, or was it all too much for you last time we did it? So you've got this remarkable kind of transformation of the relationship there, where Dorothy is taking on the role of the guide with a friend of theirs who was a mountaineer. He's described by Wordsworth. He's from a mountainous region. And also she has worked him pretty hard, clearly, in the past, the last time we've done this. So a really interesting example, I think, of how if you took a snapshot just from 1802 or 1799, you think, oh yeah, Dorothy is being here. But actually, there's a kind of the longer and richer history, and you can see them sort of negotiating those roles and coming to forging new roles, really, forging new identities, I think.
Yeah, and also that sense with the sublime that you get where people project, they expect to respond a certain way. There's a bit of that, isn't there? Like that, well, she might have had vertigo, but also, there's lots of accounts of people sort of finding things terrifying that now we, think, oh, that's quite nice,
Yeah.
So that sort of almost self-anticipated response, as opposed to the actual experience of it, which when she's done it for a bit, she realizes, she's fine.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, she's also kind of training herself into a new form of activity by doing it regularly. Yeah, you get lots of people throwing themselves on the ground on quite gentle slopes because they're overcome by.
I mean, I still, if I'm doing a big walk like Helvellyn or Fairfield, something, I get quite anxious. I do get the day or like the morning of the day before. I always feel a bit anxious. And sort of like, oh, is the weather okay? Am I do have a bit of that always. So I'm doing one of the really big walks before I walk, and I'm always a bit relieved at the end of it. I got down, I didn't die.
Yes.
I mean, something we this is very mundane, but I mean, one of the things we forget is we can look at the weather forecast.
Yeah. Exactly. That's
so nice. Equipment. We are fully equipped and can plan the day. Back.
That's right. I mean, there's an occasion when William and Dorothy walk past Grisdale Tarn. They go across the the path that's taking them to Patterdale. And I think it's actually on the way back they get lost in mist. And Dorothy says it's only because of William's brilliant navigation that they find their way back down. And then when they're back sort of down in the village, they were at one point talking to some of the locals who kind of amazed they'd done it in those conditions, and also tell a story of 3 people who died doing exactly that. So there were real as well as imaginary dangers. Yeah. Thanks. So I want to move on to one of the other controversies which has come up both on the course this week and more generally, and that's the issue of slavery. So as people would probably know, I think it was this week, might have been last week, the National Trust, a body, of course, created in the wake of the creation of the Wordsworth Trust, posted a list of, I think, 93 houses which they own, which have links with slavery or the slave trade. And one of those that they posted they mentioned was Allen Bank, because William's brother, John, had worked for the East India Company, as we know, as a sailor. And there's been quite a bit of an outcry at this, actually, in the press that I've seen. People saying, you should not work, you shouldn't yoke William with this, and it's unfair to link him to that. So I thought it might be useful if I just said a little bit about my understanding of William's response to slavery, and then sort of get your views on it, Jeff, as the curator of the Wordsworth Trust. So, I mean, broadly speaking, we know that William was very strongly opposed to the slave trade and to slavery. He was very good friends with Thomas Clarkson. In fact, we've just mentioned it was the Clarksons' house that William and Dorothy were visiting when they were crossing past Grisdale Tarn. And Thomas Clarkson and William Wilberforce were 2 of the main figures in the abolition of the slave trade. And the Wordsworths were friendly with the Wilberforces too, weren't they? The Wilberforces stay with them in 1818. Another incident interesting where they all go up mountains on that particular weekend. So Wordsworth has this close connection with the abolitionists. Dorothy in the 1790s writes to one of her friends saying, "I hope you are an immediate abolitionist," by which she means, I hope you're someone who wants to see abolition abolished, wants to see slavery abolished straight away. Now, and in a way, I mean, that sense of being an immediate abolitionist, I find perhaps a bit helpful in thinking about William's attitude towards slavery, in that he has, what seems to me a more kind of gradual approach, or he thinks this is something that will be achieved more gradually. So certainly he writes very feelingly in support of slaves or people who have suffered as a result of the slave trade. I'm thinking there the sonnet to Toussaint Louverture, the imprisoned leader of a slave revolt. Thinking of the sonnet he writes to a black woman he sees when he's returning from France. And also in the Prelude, he's critical of the traffic in Negro blood, I think he terms it. But his view seems to be that he hopes that the general progression of mankind will lead to slavery sort of disappearing. So in the Prelude, he talks about he himself wasn't particularly committed to the abolitionist cause because he thought the natural sense of progress of history, and particularly the cause of the French Revolution, would see it abolished. And this seems to be an attitude that comes up sort of, or becomes stronger, if you like, through the rest of his life. So in the 1830s, I think it's 1833, there's a letter, isn't there, where he talks about how much he abhors slavery and detests it. But he sees it very much as a matter for the slave owner and the slave, that it needs the slave owner to realize that this is an evil, wrong, needs to be done away with, rather than therefore to be sort of political intervention on the part of the British state. So certainly, he's not, he's strongly opposed to slavery, but it's quite a complex situation in terms of the way in which he thinks about it, which is very much in terms of the if you like, sort of the practicalities of how to abolish it, as well as the moral issue. Does that, I mean, is that a fair assessment, do you think, Jeff?
It sounds entirely right to me. We touched on this a couple of weeks ago, I think, didn't we? Where we looked at Wordsworth's poem Humanity,
yeah,
and where he was as equally concerned, you might say, about the UK poor, as it were, as he was about the enslaved people further away. And the contrast, isn't it, really, with Southey and Coleridge, say, in the 1790s, where they're both writing poems and essays, and in Coleridge's Watchman, there's great essays against the horrors of enslavement. Yeah. And Wordsworth, as you say, he doesn't, as far as I know, doesn't write anything.
No. To me, it sounds very Godwinian. The account you just gave is like, you know, Godwin, who of course Wordsworth is very interested in that at that time, Jeff. So Godwin's model is always of gradual. You never have harsh change. You know, gradual change. If we each change within ourselves, the world will be a better place. We don't need anything else. So it's very Godwinian. It's like you don't rely on larger structures to change. Man must change. And that's what you're saying, Simon. You know, that until the slave owners change their thinking, it happens.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, you mentioned the National Trust, Simon, and it's not for me to comment on the National Trust. I thought it was interesting how, you know, as we know, Wordsworth lives in Allen Bank 1808 to 1811, and yet the reference that they make to John Wordsworth, who died 3 years previously, you know, prior to the Wordsworth moving there, and it's interesting how, you know, how do you, you know, are we all responsible for our brothers' behaviours, as it were? Now, it's not quite as easy as that, because we know that the Wordsworths were set to gain financially from John Wordsworth's work. So it's of the time, isn't it? And in our terms of our interpretation, we've introduced things into the cottage. You know, this notion that there's tales behind everything. Well, for example, we've got a pair of sugar cutters, and Dorothy tells the story of a local family where the wife, the mother of the family, just loves sugar, and she loves sugar so much that the husband and the children suffer financially because he or she is eating all this sugar. Well, that's an opportunity to say, well, where do we think this came from? You know, let's have that conversation. You know, and also we've got an extract from Dorothy's journal where, you know, this is another remarkable thing, isn't it, about the cottage? How Dorothy will invite complete strangers into the house to hear their story. And so she invites Isaac Chappell into the cottage. She talks to him for 2 hours. She records the conversation, and Isaac Chappell's worked on a slave ship, and he tells Dorothy the horrors of the slave journey, and that's all in Dorothy's journal. So again, through interpretation, you know, we don't shy away from these things, but I guess nor do we put it in everybody's faces. It's just it's there. It's part of the life of the time.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jeff, for explaining the position on there. Yeah. So, I mean, another controversial issue that's come up this week, so it's been very interesting to read full discussions about it, is the whole issue of the Rock of Names and the issue of, you know, is this an act of, how should we respond to that? And it may be one of the ways we need to respond to that is by actually thinking more carefully about the history of the Rock of Names, which Jeff might be able to help us with. But, you know, is this, so the word that's been used quite a lot is vandalism this week. You know, is this an act of vandalism on the part of the, you know, the circle, in that they are grinding their names into this natural object? I mean, perhaps if you want to tell us a little bit more about the Rock of Names, Jeff, we can always get Sally's views on this too.
Well, the Rock of Names, as we remember, by the banks of Thirlmere, was blown up as a means of kind of preserving it, as it were. So it was, as I remember, do I remember this correctly, or was it blown up by the Manchester authorities who had Thirlmere to put off tourists going to see it? I mean, I may have made that up, but I think there's a sort of like, I realise broadcasting this to the world is a dangerous business, but I have a sort of vague memory of that, and that it was Canon Rawnsley who then gathered the pieces to reconstruct the stone. But I think an interesting thing here is that we know, don't we, from what they tell us, that it was a penknife was used to scratch the names. Well, you've got to be at it a long time in country and slave to make the kind of marks that we've got today. And again, I'm just judging this up from memory, but I have a memory that it's a professional, well, not a professional carver, a skilled carver, who went and he properly chiseled out the names, because there are some stones by the on the banks of Windermere which have got equally beautifully chiseled out names of a similar style. So there may have been the beginnings, Coleridge's scratchings out, as it were, but then they were very much enhanced by a professional carver. So what we see today may look like a big act of vandalism, but perhaps in the Wordsworth time they were thinner scratchings that have since been built upon.
So that's very interesting. I mean, it reminds me, people may be aware that if you go to the Chateau of Chillon in Switzerland, and you go into the dungeon there where Byron sets his prisoner of Chillon, you can see carved onto one of the pillars there, Byron. And I think the current understanding of that is that Byron didn't carve his initials there, but whoever was sort of in charge of the site, and again seeking to encourage tourism at a very early stage, 1818, 1816, Byron writes that, doesn't he? Has carved them in shortly after Byron's visit as a sort of part of a tourist attraction. So these things have, complex histories. But I'm also aware, I'm aware that this is a topic that Wordsworth writes directly about, this whole process of writing in the landscape, and it links to lots of his forms of poetry, like the inscription and the epitaph, doesn't it, Sally?
Yeah, I think that's how I would understand it. I don't think it's a sort of wanton act in the way that people seem to be reacting to it. Wordsworth's very, very interested in inscription and in putting words in the landscape, really, in different ways. And one area that he's very interesting on actually is on epitaphs. And Wordsworth likes epitaphs because they're words that are part of a landscape that can be read, but that gradually lose that meaning, that gradually wear away and become an object. They're classic, aren't they? Like the tail that disappears. And so that's how I've always responded to that. I think it's about, of course, it is about an act of possession. It is partly about possession and ownership, but it is about a particular kind of way of relating, story and self to the world around you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, the poem people might like to look at if they want to pursue this a bit further is one of those poems of naming places, the one called To Joanna, which begins with an account of Wordsworth doing this into the landscape, chiseling something and being told off by the vicar who comes across him and chastises him for it. And then right at the end of the poem, Wordsworth explains why he's engaged in this act, which people might like to look at. And then he says, I chiseled out in those rude characters Joanna's name upon the living stone. And I and all who dwell by my fireside have called the lovely rock Joanna's rock. So it seems to be one of these moments which kind of make us think about the Wordsworthian persona. Do we read this as William himself, or do we read it as a particular persona that he's being critical of? And that sense of chiseling the rude characters upon the living stone, stone that life, seems to make us as readers kind of question what we're being told about, which is one of the things I like very much about Wordsworth. This sense that when you find a criticism of him, he always seems to be there before you. He's always built that in. So when people say, when they talk about his encounters with the people he bumps into, the impoverished people he bumps into, people often sort of criticize him, but no one is more critical of his own poor response often to them than Wordsworth himself, and no one is more concerned about his about the difficulties of those encounters and whether you can really understand other people than he is.
Yeah, I think that's true of Wordsworth, and it's true of Romanticism generally, and that's what really attracts me to Romantic period, because it's so self-aware, it's so knowing. And even with all the theory, late 20th century theory, most of that, like you say, you go back to the text, and you're like, well, it's already right there. It's right there, you know, in the text anyway. But hey.
Well, let's move on to the sort of the final controversy, if you like, of the week, which would be our final point of discussion, really, for today and for the course, which is the critique of Wordsworth that one learner has put forward for being, I think the words he used were an egomaniac and a megalomaniac, and saying that he didn't like Wordsworth as a result of these things. And that is not an uncommon response, it must be said. I think, you know, quite a lot of people do respond, or that's the sense they have of Wordsworth. And I know there's a long tradition, or a long critical tradition of that as well. I mean, do you want to pick up on this, Sally? I've got some thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that does come from Keats's description of Wordsworth as the egotistical sublime. So that's a very easy phrase to grab hold of and hold against Wordsworth. I've always thought it's actually a gross misunderstanding of even what Keats meant. Keats uses that concept, egotistical sublime, to define himself counter to it. So he's not, if you read it in context, he's not really having a go at Wordsworth. And actually it's the egotistical sublime, you know, it's not something bad. So really what he's saying is, you know, Wordsworth's genius, stop laughing as if I'm making this up and trying to wriggle my way out of it. It's all true. Wordsworth's genius is drawn from the self, and I mean, of course he's right. You know, that's what the Prelude's about. You know, it's about, and what Romanticism about. It's about memory. It's about the inner self and childhood and spots of time and all of that. Yes, that is where Wordsworth's genius derives. And Keats is actually saying, counter to that, you know, counter to the Wordsworthian or egotistical sublime, my genius lies in losing myself in things and in the world, you know. So he's very much using the concept. It's not really a direct attack on Wordsworth at all. It's sort of using that one model to counter, you know, with another.
It's brilliant from Keats, though, isn't it? I mean, given, you know, this is a man who's not read the Prelude. The Prelude hasn't been published, so he's saying this again in about 1818, but he's detecting from all the other Wordsworth, you know, a quality that, you know, seems best and most powerfully expressed in the Prelude. So I'm always struck by that. You know, Keats is sort of bang on the money there, even without the main piece of evidence. I mean, that's a very interesting account, great account you give. And I would say, I mean, like you, this is one of the things I actually like. I do like about Romanticism. I like this sort of this grandeur, you know, and this fact that, you know, we've got someone who decides he's going to write an epic about his own life. You know, epics are normally the foundings of civilizations or the fall of man. Here, you know, it is kind of egotistical in that way. You know, it's about the self. It's about the growth of the self. You know, my first big research project and book was on the Romantics and Napoleon. And, you know, Wordsworth both defines himself, but does feel a degree of kind of envy and sort of parallels his own career to some extent with Napoleon. So there, you know, there's a slight megalomaniac tendency, I think, there. But
you know, Wordsworth doesn't publish the Prelude, and he says, you know, it's too much to write. No one should be expected to read this, and that's one of his reasons for not publishing it is it's not appropriate. Two, it's just a warm-up exercise, Simon, to the main event.
Yes.
Which is in fact a dramatic poem. So Wordsworth is constantly adopting voices and persona as well. So, you know, he does actually do both those things quite well.
Well, and what I mean, yeah, he does absolutely, because, you know, the Prelude, we need to remember, is not a poem of sort of the great I am, to use Coleridge's phrase. It's a poem of was it for this? It's actually a poem of doubt. You know, it's a poem that comes out of anxiety and trying to understand your own role. So it seems to me it's an inquiry, as you say. But I think as well, I mean, with Wordsworth, this is also balanced with valuing of the rest of creation. You know, so it's not like he only values himself.
Yeah, exactly.
Everything else. It's that, you know, the meanest flowers, the meanest flower that blows does give thoughts that lie too deep for tears. The final line of the Immortality Ode. You know, whatever, you know, the smallest item of nature, which might seem the most insignificant, is still capable of stimulating thoughts that are beyond language.
Yeah.
So I think there is that side to Wordsworth as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You should let Jeff speak. Poor Jeff.
No, all Jeff wants to say is that on behalf of the learners on the MOOC, what a privilege it's been to hear that conversation, because I think that was absolutely stunning. Thank you both.
Well, thank you for saying
wonderful. And to be in the staff room at Lancaster University English department and hear these conversations every day, it must be quite something.
Oh yeah, we get fisticuffs.
Yes,
that was amazing. Thank you both.
No, well, thank you for listening. Thank you for saying that. I mean, which is probably a good point to sort of to draw things to a close with some thank yous, but then also to look forward to ways in which people might continue their engagement with Wordsworth, particularly through the trust. So, you know, I would at the end of the course, I would obviously very much like to thank Jeff and Sally for their participation in the course and in these videos. Thanks Sharon as well, who's been guiding us through the week. Thanks Kate for her involvement today. Thanks, of course, very much to our two excellent mentors, Andrew Lacey and Frank Pearson, been brilliant throughout the course. Who else do I? The ISS team, Phil Tubman, particularly there at Lancaster University. Keith and Jen have done a great job, I think, of voicing William and Dorothy for us through these weeks. But I mean, I guess thank you particularly to, you know, all the contributors to the course, all the participants, all the learners who've all really got stuck in, shared their ideas, supported each other with recommendations and encouragements and queries and questions. I mean, as you gather, I mean, we really enjoyed doing this course. You know, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure for us to do the course, and you know, that wouldn't be the case if it weren't for everyone who's contributing. So thank you all. Your engagement with Wordsworth and Dorothy hopefully won't stop now. Hopefully, you know, you will continue to read and continue to think about these. But there is a specific way of doing this as well, which is the set of online events that the Wordsworth Trust has set up to take the place of its normal in-person events. So perhaps, I mean, I'll just hand over to you there, Jeff, and ask you to tell our learners about what you're offering.
Sure. So first of all, please come to Dove Cottage. Please come to Wordsworth Grasmere. See it. We're open right through until mid-December, certainly as it stands, all being well. You know, book a ticket if you can, otherwise come on the day. Secondly, if you wish to come and see the Jerwood Centre and see things for yourself, just let us know. We'll do our best to accommodate that as well, to see the real thing, as it were. And then, as Simon said, we've got a series of events coming up, which we hope will build on. And it's Simon and I will be in conversation with some people of Wordsworthians, you might say, with a Wordsworthian specialism. And we're going to take some of the discussion points from the MOOC and introduce those into the conversations. And so on the 8th of October, we have Jonathan Bate, who's going to start the series. Jonathan, as you probably all know, has just produced a new biography of Wordsworth, the radical Wordsworth. So that's on the 8th. And then on the 22nd, it's very difficult to say, isn't it? But there's been at least 2 really good Wordsworthian biographies, and another of those is by Stephen Gill. And some learners will know the first edition of Stephen's book, while it's updated with what Stephen has learned. And we'll be asking him what he feels has changed in Wordsworth, his understanding and appreciation of Wordsworth in the last 20, 30 years. And then on the 12th of November, we have Kerry Andrews, and we'll be talking with Kerry about Dorothy Wordsworth in particular, and Dorothy Wordsworth as a walker. But there's 3 more after that into November. Regency, Life in Regency, Britain. We'll be looking at Wordsworth's Guide to the Lakes, and we'll be looking also at tourism in the lakes in the 19th century and Wordsworth's impact on that. And that's between now and Christmas. I ought to say that as of yesterday, Jonathan Bates on the 8th, we've sold 49 tickets. and there are only 100 available. So on listening to this, just do it. Just sign up.
I didn't realise that. I didn't realise there was enough.
Oh yeah, there'll be demand and pressure.
Let's hope so.
Yeah. Let's hope go to our website. Go to the Wordsworth Grasmere website and look for the events, and that's how you can sign up.
I'll put the links in the comments section as well, so that people can find it there. Okay, so that's great, Jeff, and hopefully people will make the most of that opportunity to continue thinking and learning about Wordsworth. So that's it. Thank you all very much, and we hope to see you again, either in the real or the virtual Wordsworthian world. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.